Our preaching text today is the most beloved psalm, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Good morning, church.
Good morning.
As I mentioned earlier, my beloved Beth and I have been away this past week, enjoying some time in Florida. So in today's sermon, I'm going to present some material from a lecture series I gave years ago. And I do this in the context of our beloved Psalm 23, especially the phrase, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. The psychiatrist M. Scott Peck begins his famous first book, The Road Less Traveled, with these words: life is difficult. I begin today with these words: life is disappointing. No matter how good we may seem to have it, life will be disappointing. And I believe part of the pain of aging has to do with the accumulation of disappointments. How many of us have had perfect childhoods with nary a wound inflicted on our tender psyches? How many of us have jobs that utilize all of our gifts and talents? How many of us are adequately appreciated by our bosses? How many of us have never had a conflict with our loved ones? How many of us have ever felt ourselves lost? How many of us have been in constant communication with our Creator? How many of us have ever suffered through a devastating illness or accident? How many of us have ever experienced a lonely time? Well, you get the idea. I could spend our entire sermon time just listing the things around which disappointments coalesce. So how is it, sisters and brothers, that we don't all collapse into despair? And it's true that humans are very resilient. Yet, how we handle the disappointments of our lives determines to a great extent the quality of our lives. As Wayne Mueller points out in his wonderful book, Legacy of the Heart, The Spiritual Advantages of a Painful Childhood, every family has its own regrets, opportunities lost, unfortunate relatives, unsatisfying jobs or bad marriages. And after a while, we learn to protect our hearts by altering our expectations to fit the shape of our childhood scars. Rather than expect the best, we began to expect the worst. And over time, these chronic disappointments generate a sense of despair. Many of us, brothers and sisters, find our lives to be somewhat at least disappointing. And we wonder about this God who is supposed to be shepherding us through the darkest valleys. In our lives, we hear so much bad news that we may wonder if happiness and joy are but illusions. Many of us may well wonder when the good news is going to start. As Mueller states, some of us still expect our parents, friends, or spouses to finally become the loving people we always wanted them to be. We think of how it might have been if only the right person or career had come along. Some of us, Mueller contends, are still so attached to these hopes that we have not begun to live our lives in earnest. We are still patiently waiting for the world to match our perfect picture of how things should be. Yet, when we hold tightly to our demands and expectations, we invite lives of disappointment and despair. So this morning, church, I'd like to shine a light on some dimensions of the emotional pain to which we are all exposed. Because, sisters and brothers, how we seek and find comfort throughout our lives is a very important life decision. For most of us, the darkest valley is the one filled with the most painful emotions. And what are the painful emotions? Grief, despair, fear, the experience of loneliness, anger, rage, shame, guilt. These can all be included. But sometimes these emotions are spoken of as destructive or negative emotions. This, I believe, is a mistake. There are no destructive or negative emotions. Emotions are, as the name implies, ways to get us moving, energies available to us to do something. As Daniel Goleman notes in his bestseller, Emotional Intelligence, all emotions are, in essence, their impulses to act. The instant plans for handling life that evolution has instilled in us. And we would go on to say that our Creator has generated in us. Emotions, in other words, are survival tools. And certainly, our emotions can overwhelm us. But we need to see them for what they are. Life aids. Emotions are what give color to our lives. I don't believe in a purely rational approach to life. Many of the Greek philosophers believe that reason should be the ruler of our lives. And this is, like many things, a half-truth. A purely reasoned approach to life is non-human. So, let's get back to the painful emotions. They're sometimes spoken of as the dark emotions. Miriam Greenspan writes the following in her book, Healing Through the Dark Emotions. In my 30 years as a psychotherapist, I've come to believe that the inability to bear grief, fear, and despair is the source of much of our individual and collective ills. These are the emotions we must avoid, and we most avoid, but we need to attend to. She writes, "The inability to tolerate grief, fear, and despair is a major feature of the epidemic of addictions that so afflicts our civilization." She argues that our society is an emotion-phobic society. We seem to be unable to tolerate strong emotions. You may remember in grade school, many of us were graded on self-control. I always got good grades on self-control. And self-control is important in maintaining an orderly classroom. Yet what happens when we are given an image of control that keeps us from experiencing our own emotions? Greenspan points out that most of us were hushed when we were sad, shushed when we were mad, pushed away when we were scared. We were exhorted to control our feelings or hide them out of sight. She concludes that we live in a culture in which the common denominator in our emotional education is suppression, intolerance, shaming, punishment, and neglect. It is a culture in which we learn to do all kinds of things to avoid the power of emotion. We become overly busy. We avoid conflict. We numb ourselves. We act out in various destructive ways. We take drugs. She says the energy of the dark emotions is routinely converted to a host of toxic behaviors and mental states, including anxiety, depression, addiction, abuse, violence, and isolation. I strongly believe that Greenspan is on to something important. When we refuse to tolerate the suffering involved in our experience of painful emotions, when we refuse the experience of sadness and tears, life's joys become impossible to experience in their full glory and color. I've talked about this before, about how we all of us need to weep. This is how we need to see God's hand working among us. The dark emotions, Greenspan argues, can be our best, although most demanding spiritual teachers, when we can get beyond the compulsion to control them. The flow of the dark emotions moves us toward the spiritual strengths we most cherish: gratitude, joy, faith, courage, and compassion. Sisters and brothers, because we so fear painful emotions, we try to armor ourselves, protect ourselves from this dark energy. Many people, and men especially, suggests Greenspan, cannot tell the difference between the various dark emotions, so that all the dark emotional energies are experienced as anger. She writes, "Emotional control is a special requisite for men, who are taught early and often violently that any emotion but anger is effeminate. But women too," she adds, "if they are, quote, classy, must learn to endure their emotions in silence." And writing about grief which has been driven underground, Greenspan suggests Whereas girls and women tend to turn their grief into depression, boys and men are more likely to turn it into anger, which often masks a more male style of depression. Brothers and sisters, life is hard, life is disappointing. Yet when we feel emotional pain, when we feel ourselves trapped in darkness, perhaps we should befriend the darkness a bit and become more capable of bearing suffering, of bearing sadness, and expressing it. Greenspan notes that a low tolerance for sadness is actually a major predisposing factor towards depression. Now, church, when we acknowledge that we are suffering, when we admit it to ourselves, we begin to recognize that everyone we see, everyone we know, is carrying his or her own sadness, his or her own suffering. And we are here in church together to help bear each other's pain, each other's suffering. Is this not so? Greenspan warns, the dark emotions are like young children. If you attend to them, they reward you. If you don't, prepare for trouble. We need to befriend all our emotions. But to befriend them, we must get close to what we want to run away from. And we must also surrender to our emotions, a kind of deep acceptance of them. Brothers and sisters, Lent, this season, Lent, is the perfect time to embrace all of our emotions, all of them, even those that cause us pain. All of them are gifts from our Creator. And God has never promised us an easy, a carefree, a pain-free life. What God has promised us is to walk with us, to be with us through every valley, even those that are the deepest and the darkest. And not only is God walking with us through those dark valleys, we walk together with all our brothers and sisters in faith. And I promise you to walk with you through any and every valley, no matter how deep, no matter how dark. This is my promise as your pastor. And I make this promise, church, because I know without hesitation that just as my beloved Beth will walk with me through any deep, any dark valley that I am called to walk through, so will my brothers and sisters here at Morgan Park Baptist Church. Is this not so? So, sisters and brothers, let us walk hand in hand with our God. Let us walk hand in hand with one another. Let us walk hand in hand with trust and hope and faith and love. Because even though we walk through the darkest valley, we fear no evil, for you are with us, and you comfort us. Amen? Amen.